Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Poppy, I Disagree. This was my first time really listening to a Poppy project in full. Not that I've, been against listening to them in the past. In fact, I've been interested in doing so, just for a variety of reasons. I haven't, had the chance to do so. But with a new year starting and with little else on my plate to cover at this point in the year, I figured now is as good a time as any to really check out this album and see what the fuss is about here, especially since I did hear some positive things about this album. The sound of this project is one that is pretty unique overall, as it's pretty much Poppy attempting a full-on metal release, and I have heard that she has played around with metal at various points in her previous material. Again, I haven't heard any of that material, so I can't say myself if that's the case or not, but on this project here, for the most part, every track on this thing is a metal song through and through. I mean, the pop element to things is still definitely there, but it still is very much a metal album at the same time. It's a very nice mixture between the two sounds in a way that ends up sounding pretty unique and interesting overall. The closest thing I could probably compare this to would be something like baby metal, or lots of similar bands coming out of Japan that mix that style of J-pop idol music with metal music. Only in the case of this project, it's more so mixing maybe a more Western pop artist with heavy metal music. It still has the catchiness, the poppiness to it, while also mixing in the metal. It's just, I guess, a more Western version of that sound in a sense. There definitely are more differences to it, but that's probably the closest approximation that I could make. When it comes to the metal that's mixed into this record, for the most part, it's a type of metal that feels not too far removed from a lot of the metal that was pretty popular in the late 90s, in the early 2000s. It kind of has that sort of alternative metal, almost new metal-like sound to it. There's also a fair helping of some electronic elements mixed into this thing too, that leads to an almost industrial-like sound to this thing at times. A poppier version of it, no pun intended of course, maybe something a bit more like Nine Inch Nails or Marilyn Manson, as opposed to maybe some of the heavier, more brutal industrial acts out there. But yeah, when it comes to the metal here on this thing, it kind of harkens back to that older metal sound, but at the same time it does seem like a bit of an update on this sound. It removes some of the elements to it that I and a lot of other people don't particularly care for, while at the same time keeping some of that heaviness to it and that very straightforward approach to metal writing. One thing I do like about the choice to focus on this style of metal over maybe a different one is that, when it comes to new metal and alternative metal and genres like these, typically really complex songwriting and flashy solos and things like that aren't really the focus of those kinds of songs, and that's very much the case here on this project too. You maybe occasionally get a solo on this thing that is maybe a little flashy or something like that, but for the most part, the instrumentals here on this thing go for a more simplistic, straightforward, heavy approach to their sound. And I think this actually works very nicely in the context of this project, as given that this is a Poppy record and Poppy herself is the star of this thing, it makes sense for the instrumentals to really just be backing her up here on this thing, as opposed to stealing the spotlight from her herself, as if that was the case, would it really feel like a Poppy album now, would it? Or at least I wouldn't expect it to fit that mold nicely in that case. I feel like it makes sense here with this kind of instrumental styling to have it just back up what she's doing on the vocals here on this project. And when it comes to some of the poppier elements on this project, they come mostly from Poppy herself and her vocals. Like I said before, you have some electronic elements mixed into some of the instrumentals here on this thing that oftentimes lead to a kind of industrial sound, but rarely do the instrumentals here kind of just go for, a maybe straightforward, catchy, sugary pop sound that you might more typically expect from an artist like this. Occasionally it does happen on this thing, and I will talk about some of those moments a bit more later on, but for the most part, the poppier sounds on this thing, like I said, come from the vocals, which are still pretty standard sounding for this kind of pop music, I guess. Not to say that they're bad sounding at all. In fact, I think the vocals on this thing sound quite nice, and the very sugary approach to how they're sung pairs up really interestingly with a lot of the heavier instrumentals on this thing. So yeah, overall the mixture of sounds here on this record, the heavier metal elements and the poppier, catchier vocals, it just yeah, it pairs up to make a really good mixture, I guess. I find it to be pretty interesting, it's pretty unique, and it's pulled off pretty nicely too. Like I alluded to before, despite the fact that most of this record does follow the sound I mentioned previously, there are some tracks that break away from this mold to some extent. Probably one of the biggest examples would be the track Nothing I Need, which is just a more straightforward pop track on this thing. It does have a bit of a darker edge to it with some of the lyrics packed into this track and just the overall vibe that this thing brings to the album, but still the instrumental to this thing isn't super heavy, it's a lot more light sounding, and Poppy's vocals on this thing very similarly also have a bit of a poppier, lighter sound to them too. Overall, it's a nice change of pace on the project. I think this style has performed pretty nicely. And like I said before, the fact that the atmosphere of this song is still kind of dark sounding, it makes for this song not really sticking out in an uncomfortable way. Like I said, it feels more like a nice little change of pace in the record as opposed to just this weird detour. And then towards the end of the record, you get the track Sick of the Sun, which is also a bit of a later moment on this thing. It's not super poppy per se, it's a lot more rock leaning, but it does so in a way that's not really super heavy or anything like that. It reminds me a lot more of like a ballad that I would have heard coming out of like the 90s or something like that, though of course with a bit more of a modern finish to it at the same time. I love Poppy's vocals here on this thing. I love the very sad feeling of this track too. Again, it almost feels like one of those sadder ballads that you might hear a grunge band in the 90s penning instead, with a bit less grunge in it. Really, it just kind of gives me that vibe overall, and I think again, it's just a nice change of pace in the record that doesn't distract from the album's overall, sound and aesthetic. The song Don't Go Outside, the closing track to the record, is another one that I want to highlight here, not necessarily because the sound of this track is super different from a lot of the other moments on this project, but structurally it is one of the more interesting tracks on this record, beginning a bit more typically when in comparison to a lot of the other songs on the record. But one thing I really liked about this track is how a good portion of the way into the track, Poppy starts bringing back a lot of these lyrics and vocals that appeared at various other points earlier on the record. It just makes for a very conclusive moment on this project, and as a final track on this thing, it plays the role perfectly. The opening to this thing, Concrete, is another moment on the project that I think structurally is a bit more interesting than a lot of the other songs on the record, just because it really bounces back and forth between the heavier metal parts of the project and the very sugary, poppier elements in a really nice manner overall between some of the heavier parts that are worked into the verses here and just that very sugary, sweet, cutesy chorus on this song too that's also incredibly catchy. It's just a perfect opener to this project as it really just packs into this track's pretty, tight runtime all of the core ideas that you're going to hear on the rest of the album. When it comes to the lyrics here on this project, a lot of the songs here talk about things like breaking away from a mold, disagreeing, stuff like that, things that given the album title might make a good amount of sense, and I think these topics of rebellion fit pretty nicely with a lot of the heavy instrumentation here on this project. And I think a lot of the lyrics on this thing are also pretty well written too, and I think Poppy's deliveries on these tracks are impassioned in a way where she can get across a lot of that anger very nicely, even if her deliveries here are still kind of poppy at times. And on some of these sadder tracks on this thing too, she still manages to sound pretty sad even if the songs are pretty catchy still. Now, when initially listening through this album and reading along with the lyrics, I thought that some of the lyrics on this thing might be inspired by Poppy's recent split with her creative partner, Titanic Sinclair, considering what was going around there wasn't, I guess, the prettiest according to some of the stuff Poppy had posted to her social media, but I was actually kind of surprised to find out that he has some creative involvement in this project still, so I don't know, maybe the lyrics are still written about this, just, before the split actually happened, formally speaking. But, yeah, I'm not 100% sure about that, but I do think the lyrics on this thing could certainly be reflective of that, and if they are, it would actually make a fair bit of sense. When it comes to complaints that I have with this record, I wouldn't say that there's too many, honestly. I think that some of Poppy's vocals at certain points on Fill the Crown can sound maybe a bit too nasally and awkward for me to really get behind fully, but even on this track, a lot of the other parts of the song are really great and more than make up for some of the song's shortcomings. And for example, another track like Bite Your Teeth, for example, is just one that I think is maybe a bit more lackluster than some of the other songs in the track listing, though. Again, it's still a pretty solid track, and for what it's worth, it is probably one of the heaviest songs on this entire album. So if you're into just really heavy music, this might not be a bad one to check out before any of the other tracks if you're just wanting to give maybe one or two tracks from this thing a listen to see if you want to dive into the rest of the album in full. But if you are in that position, I would still certainly recommend that you do give this album a full listen, because overall I think it's a pretty unique, fun, and worthwhile experience. Poppy blends together elements of pop music and metal music on this thing in a very creative and unique way overall. Again, there are certainly other artists out there that have toyed around with metal and pop together, but I don't feel like any of those experiments have come out quite like this record has, between its unique blend of sounds and Poppy's personality and the lyrics here on this thing. It's just a unique project that I feel like you can't really get the same experience anywhere else for something like this. And again, the hooks on this thing are really catchy. The lyrics on this thing are really well written too. The entire album feels very cohesive, and I like the fact that a lot of these songs kind of build on each other, and it just makes for a nice album experience. So yeah, overall I don't have too many complaints with this project. It's a pretty solid metal and pop release. So yeah, if you like those kinds of music, certainly give this project a listen to, because you will certainly not be disappointed. But yeah, overall that's just my thoughts on this release. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment sections down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. Again, thank you for watching, and stay golden.